Hi, I'm Jim Pinkerton.
And I'm James Poulos.
And together we are Blogging Heads TV for today.
Howdy.
James? Hi. Never rehearsed in advance. That's the key thing to give that spirit of spontaneity.
That's right. Perhaps you could remind our viewers who you are and what you do.
I'm Jim Pinkerton. I'm a contributor at the Fox News Channel and a fellow at the New America Foundation. And way back in the age of the IBM Selectric, I worked in the Reagan and Bush 41 White Houses.
And I'm James Poulos, as I just said. Slightly after the era of the Selectric, I became a graduate fellow at the Tocqueville Forum at Georgetown University, studying political theory. And I am the new managing director of Ricochet, an online political forum that will be launching soon, coming to your internet. Keep your eyes peeled.
Okay. Right. We'll all look forward to it. In any case, with those introductions out of the way, President Obama was just in town with 47 heads of state, signing a nuclear anti-proliferation deal. What do you think?
I think that this is, on balance, good news. I'm not terribly worried about decreasing our stockpiles in a methodical and prudent way. I think this is broadly in line with the Reagan policy in that regard. Of course, there are a couple different ways that you can do disarmament or at least backpedaling on nukes. I think that it's important that when you do carry forward that line of policy, you do so in a way that does maintain a certain level of, for lack of a better word, toughness. I know that there can be excesses where the policy becomes one of only rhetorical toughness. We don't want that either. But you don't want to carry out the sort of nuclear agreements that we're continuing to do in a good way in a broader context of weakness.
I agree. I was actually at a press breakfast Tuesday morning hosted by Americans for Tax Reform and the American Spectator magazine with Newt Gingrich, who was quite stinging on all this Obama nuclear diplomacy. He had nothing bad to say about trying to restrain the proliferation of nuclear materials, and it's great that the Ukraine is giving up its nuclear materials, although these things have to be verified, and that's kind of hard. As Gingrich said, the CIA was totally taken by surprise by both the India and Pakistan nuclear explosions. They had no idea that such a thing was possible back decades ago. And he then went further to say that, to remind the audience that back in the 20s and 30s we were signing arms control treaties right and left, ships and so on, with Germany, Japan, and so on. We even outlawed war, according to an international treaty that was ratified 85-1 by the U.S. Senate. And in fact, as he reminded us, from 1932 to 1934, there was a prolonged arms control disarmament summit in Geneva that didn't even stop even as Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. So Newt's bottom line was that negotiations and discussions and treaties don't change intentions, and if they leave you weaker relative to potential aggressors, then you're a lot worse off.
Now, did he say anything specifically about Russia's intentions in that regard? Did he try to capture the nature of the U.S.-Russia relationship as it's changed from the Bush era?
Actually, no, it's funny. I was going to ask about that, and I didn't get the chance. I mean, I can volunteer that, just my own opinion, that at the moment that President Obama was signing the arms control treaty in Prague, that was when the Russians seemingly were behind the overthrow of a seemingly pro-Western government, pro-American government in Kyrgyzstan. And most people don't know where Kyrgyzstan is. I had to look it up too. But it's in Central Asia. It's right near Afghanistan. It's near China. It's obviously near Russia. It's near Iran. And we've been using Kyrgyzstan as a base for our efforts in Afghanistan, just a little ways away. And now I think the future of that base is in question. Now, exactly why America's national security depends on having a base in Kyrgyzstan is a question we can take up sometime. But but it does appear that in the great game of controlling Central Asia, the Russians are, as it were, rolling us up there. And you would think, or one might think, that if President Obama was worried about the overall balance of power between America and Russia, that he would bring that up and say, listen, we're really not going to be signing treaties with you until, if we think that, as NPR said in its report from Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, that this is a, quote, proxy war, unquote, between the U.S. and Russia. That doesn't sound very promising for the Russians' willingness to abide by any treaty, or for that matter, our ultimate willingness to abide by any such treaty.
Well, that said, I think I'd be a little more hesitant to condemn what Russia might or might not be doing in Central Asia. I think we have to move away from the idea that there was a clean break between the Soviet Union and the Russia that inherited the mess. A lot of these conflicts that we see scattered throughout the post-Soviet space are conflicts that were never really fully resolved or tied up. Certainly, what's going on in Kyrgyzstan is different than, for example, what's going on in Georgia with Abkhazia, and even what's going on in Ukraine with Crimea. There are unresolved issues there that run, I think, pretty deep, not just as a matter of politics and war, but as actual legal questions as well. But as far as Kyrgyzstan goes, this has been a part of the world where there really hasn't been a steady settlement when it comes to who's sort of on top and who's not. I know that this base has been in and out of contention for a place where we can reliably put boots on the ground for a long period of time. So perhaps Russia's been involved, perhaps they haven't. I think the argument to make here is that it's more important for the United States to pursue its relationship with Russia directly in a bilateral way than it is to perhaps derail that relationship, which is an important one, over questions of what's going on in the periphery.
I don't disagree particularly. I mean, there are the breakup of the Soviet Union left something like 25 million ethnic Russians scattered around in all the various former Soviet republics, from the Baltics to Central Asia. And just reading somewhere that RT television, Russia television, or Russia Today television, has been sort of beaming, information / propaganda to the substantial ethnic Russian population in Kyrgyzstan. So I'm sure the legalities, the technicalities of all these things are enormously difficult, and as a practical matter, Kyrgyzstan is a lot more obviously within the Russian sphere of influence than it is of, say, the American sphere of influence, because we're 8,000 miles away. So I don't disagree that that it's not promising to try and base Russian relations on U.S.-Russian relations on they're playing nicey-nice with the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs and the Turkmens and the Tajiks and so on. I mean, that's just probably beyond our reach. However, we still have to ask, and this is a question about going back to President Obama and President Medvedev and his boss, Prime Minister Putin. Is it really in America's interest to be reducing nuclear stockpiles alongside the Russians, when I don't think that the history of Soviet or Russian compliance with treaties is very good? And so, as Gingrich was saying, to lull ourselves into thinking that we're making the world safer and more peaceful by signing pieces of paper, I think is a open question. Unfortunately, the Obama administration, which has declared its commitment to eliminate nuclear weapons, which I think would be a hideous mistake, doesn't seem to be very interested in trying to address.
Well, right. I'm not for eliminating nukes either by any stretch. I do think the Russians have been better at following these sorts of treaties than perhaps other treaties. But the real question here, I think, is to what extent or to what degree this deal bears upon the continuing slow-motion crisis with Iran. And in this case, I'm really not sure that it's going to get us any leverage. I wish that it would. I wish that it would curry some favor with the Russians that would allow us to sort of pivot away from what I think has been a more or less successful stalling tactic to probably more of an assertive, if not aggressive, line or stance of the sort that even the Hillary Clintons or the Joe Bidens of the world might prefer to what Obama wants.
Yeah, I got to tell you, think that the reality is that nuclear weapons aren't very hard to make, and there's a great incentive to get them. And so I sort of think that one way or another, even including if the Israelis or the U.S. bombs Iran somehow, that we're going to wake up 10 years from now and realize that Iran is a nuclear power, which makes me a fervent proponent of missile defense, which is, again, one of those areas where I think the Obama administration has severely underestimated the importance of it. If we have 20 or 30 or 40 nuclear powers in the world, missile defense is going to look like a darn good idea, and the country with the best missile defense, whatever it is, whether it's the U.S. or Japan or China or Israel or who knows, is going to be a lot better off than countries that are vulnerable to umpty-ump countries that could come and nuke them.
Well, I think that's right. And as quote-unquote soft on Russia as I might be relative to others on the political right, I certainly don't want to see these kinds of deals being signed with Russia at the expense of a responsible full-spectrum non-proliferation policy that recognizes if Iran goes nuclear, the rest of the Middle East, in large part, is going to go nuclear. I don't think that anyone has any confusion over whether or not this is going to happen. I think it is going to happen. It's going to be to our detriment. It's going to be to the detriment of our regional allies. It's going to be to the detriment of Europe. And, again, I wasn't pounding the table for a bomb Iran campaign a couple of years ago. But now it's a couple of years later. That doesn't mean bomb Iran now, right? But it does mean that a policy that has worked as sort of a stalling action while we were taking care of other pressing business in other areas of the world might have to change, and change soon.
Well, I mean, maybe. But I don't think the Russians and the Chinese are ever going to go along with anything real. I think speaking of stalling tactics, I think they will endlessly whittle around on negotiations and sanctions and negotiations and so on. I mean, I just don't think that the Russians or the Chinese want us to succeed in the Middle East, and in part because we seem to have a predilection for putting bases in places like Kyrgyzstan in their backyard. That I'm sure they don't want to. They would like those bases not to be there, and they succeeded. The Russians succeeded in evicting us from Uzbekistan a few years ago, and the Russians and the Chinese created the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is kind of, for lack of a better term, a defense pact against countries not in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And the leaders are Russia and China, with various other countries as having some sort of status within it. Again, I just. It's clearly not in Russia's or China's interest to have Iran go nuclear, but I think they make the calculation that's a less bad alternative than having America with a huge footprint in their backyard.
Right. Russia really owes it to Iran to keep things on its southern border as quiet as possible. I think one of the most worrisome developments here has been the frustration of the old model, under which if you get the Russians to go along, great power politics will cause China to go along too. That seems to be decreasingly the case nowadays. And one of the things policymakers, I think, should be particularly attuned to now is the way in which China is developing a really independent and incrementally robust, but robustly independent foreign policy. So it's not just a matter of, get the Russians to yes and the Chinese will follow suit. Even if we were to get the Russians to yes in their own right, which might have a certain set of benefits, that still might not be enough in the case of something like Iran to get us the kind of solution that we want without having to resort to force.
Right. I mean, I just think that the Chinese have so many relations with Iran that, again, they're never going to go along. And we have to sort of confront the reality of the UN Security Council, which, the 5 permanent members with the veto, and two of them are pretty much on our side, Britain and France, and the other 2, China and Russia, are not. That to me, that sounds like a deadlock or a gridlock in the UN Security Council, which is the only part of the UN that has any kind of credibility in terms of international affairs. If that is, for reasons I think we both agree on, then the UN Security Council sort of goes the way of the League of Nations as a effective arbiter for anything.
All of which makes me lament the way in which the Obama administration has turned a cold shoulder to France, of all countries, right? Here's a country which is looking to take a more proactive role in Iran, looking to take a more proactive role on Mediterranean security, looking to form closer ties and a better working relationship with the United States. And some of this is personalities. Sarkozy and Obama might not mix as well as any two other leaders, but we should be able to transcend those sorts of differences. And there's a real opportunity here for U.S.-French cooperation. At a time
I agree. I mean, if we can't get along with France, we're sure as heck not going to get along with Russia and China. I mean, you got to start somewhere.
Well, right, and if there was ever sort of a promising relationship for a new, sort of more Euro-friendly administration to build, you would think it would be this one. At precisely a time when Britain is seeming to be decreasingly relevant on the world stage, and China and Russia are becoming more robust. Russia's still in play. China seems to be less so. In my mind, now is exactly the right time for the United States to be building a closer, more effective relationship with France, and Obama's really failed in this regard.
Yeah, and of course, so Sarkozy said, "Look, obviously France will never give up its nuclear deterrent. I mean, they're not dumb,
right?
I mean, they know the French, right, have a there's a reason why France has been an identifiable country for a couple thousand years. They know something about national survival and national destiny. They've made their mistakes, obviously, and lost some wars, but they keep coming back and they keep proving that they have a substantial role to play. And I quite agree. I mean, NATO is the American base, as it were, and Britain and France are both vital parts of that. And we've got to make. If we can't make that work, we got nothing at all. So.
Of course, anyway, we all understand why people would sort of continue to rib the French for being surrender monkeys, but I think conservatives really do themselves a disservice, and this goes for everyone, not just conservatives, to write the French off in this way as people who, in some deeply rooted cultural or civilizational way, are unreliable or prone to giving up and throwing up their arms. Yes, kill our children and rape our women, just don't destroy our art. If you look in sort of the long view of French history, that was a blip on the radar, and looking forward to a Europe that's going to be, if it's not already, besieged with a number of really serious and in some ways intractable problems. If it's not going to be French leadership, God knows where it's going to come from.
Right. I mean, look, the French had 5% of their population killed in World War I, which would be the equivalent of 15 million people getting killed in America, and I wonder how much fight we'd have in us if we'd had 15 million people killed in the war. These things come and go. For every Marshal Pétain, there was a Napoleon or a Vercingetorix, and so there's plenty of reason there. But in any case, Gingrich, I should come back to him because he was full of interesting things. As I said, he reminded us all of this completely failed arms limitation treaty process in Geneva from 1932 to 1934, at the same time that Hitler was coming into Germany and that Mussolini was preparing to invade Ethiopia, and that Japan was in the process of trying to conquer China, and that the Soviets were busy exterminating 10 million or so of their own people in the Ukrainian collectivizations and so on. He also, and I know you make an emphasis in your studies on 19th century history, said that what the Republicans need, I mean, I'm shifting gears here pretty profoundly from foreign policy to domestic policy, is a Jeffersonian and Jacksonian rebellion, peaceful but nonetheless rebellion against the Democrats and President Obama. Now, we all know Thomas Jefferson, but Jackson, obviously in this case, is Andrew Jackson, our seventh president, who is not that well known or frankly that well regarded by contemporary historians and historiography. Right.
This seems to me, at least, to be an obvious reference or bank shot off of Walter Russell Mead's famous division of Americans, really, into four groups: the Jeffersonians, Jacksonians, Hamiltonians, and Wilsonians. So it seems like what Newt is proposing here is that the Republicans occupy two of the four quadrants and array themselves against the other two. So
you ought to detail what those four the Meade's categorizations are.
Right. So basically,
what they mean for American politics.
Sure. The Jeffersonians are Americans who instinctually or in a sort of more intellectual way support and favor something broadly along the lines of Jefferson's agrarian republicanism. So citizen landowners or property holders who can carry on American politics best by developing relationships with one another and maintaining a certain distance, but a cordial one, and staying away from the entangling alliances of European and Old World powers that Washington too warned us about. Jacksonians.
I would add on the Jeffersonians that modern day liberals and libertarians both kind of trace their origins to Thomas Jefferson. In a weird way, I mean, both the libertarians and the liberals are sort of thinking that they are carrying on either the sort of idealism and enlightenment of Jefferson or the sort of anti-tax small government of Jefferson, both of which Thomas Jefferson believed and as different as today's liberals and libertarians might appear to be. In many ways, they're quite similar.
Well, that's right. And what's interesting to me about the typology here is that Jeffersonians, in spite of being sort of cosmopolitan idealists from a certain angle, are people who are generally unwilling or very hesitant to translate that kind of internationalist idealism into a robustly internationalist foreign policy where intervention is always on the table and where you're building robust international organizations. So there's that. Jacksonians, on the other hand, don't tread on me, Americans. Right? They're hesitant to get involved in wars overseas, but goodness, look out! When we are in one, we're going to fight it to the finish, and we're going to fight it to the death. And it's kind of the old line about rousing the sleeping giant, and what a bad idea that is.
Right. The Jacksonians are also anti-government, suspicious of centralized power,
populist.
As Newt reminded the audience, they Andrew Jackson probably won the 1824 election, but had it taken away from him in the Electoral College, and then they did win in 1828, and it was the first genuine sort of peaceful but genuine sort of political overturning in the nascent American democracy.
Right, in the infamous White House party where Jackson threw open the doors to the White House and the rubes started eating all the cheese and the Federalists had to climb out the back window and all that fun. I think it was actually Jackson himself who had to duck out since he was in danger of being mobbed by the very excited
by supporters.
Right. Okay, so that's one side of the ledger. On the other side, and of course, you can sort of split. You can match the pairs in different ways, and so it's interesting that Newt pairs the Jacksonians and the Jeffersons right now. Brings to mind, of course, the Democrats' Jefferson-Jackson dinner, but story for another time. On the other side, you've got Hamiltonians who are economic superpower freaks more than hard power freaks. So big on capitalism, big on commerce. Big on looking eastward across the Atlantic. This is to hark back to the times at which the players were actually alive and walking around America, rather than westward, not inward looking but outward looking. The idea here is that if America is first among nations when it comes to this robust, muscular commercial power, then that can set the tone and set the tempo of international relations for building the kinds of institutions in which, yes, we're playing ball with other powers, and we're maintaining, we're in the arena, so to speak, when it comes to jockeying for influence and exercising our interests, but we're really at the top of the heap all the time, or for the foreseeable future.
Right, and I would add, just on the Hamiltonians, that a pro-business, pro-capitalist orientation means the government as a partner in such things, and that includes what Hamilton called internal improvements, which would be canals, later extended to railroads and highways and ports, and I think also the internet. I mean, all those things that never really would have gotten off the ground were it not for DeWitt Clinton building the Erie Canal and Lincoln building the railroads and Eisenhower the interstate highways. The things that we take for granted, actually, somebody had to think of doing those things, and that was the Hamiltonian tradition at work.
Right. The catchphrase here would be not necessarily big government, but definitely strong government. Government that's capable of doing things well. Hamilton, of course, being the guy who favored an American king. You can see how the criticism directed at Hamiltonians would tend to go in that direction. But then the fourth quadrant is the Wilsonian quadrant. It's also revealing, I think, that you've got a bunch of Democrats, and Hamilton occupies this sort of Federalist quadrant. But Wilson, definitely a Democrat. Wilsonians typified, according to Mead, as the kinds of Americans who are very much unlike the Jacksonians, eager to spread America's interests and American values around the world, convinced that the spread of interests and values goes hand in hand, that you can't advance America's standing in the world and you can't secure America's interests in the world without also promoting our values and making sure that they take root elsewhere.
Right, and of course the leading Wilsonian of our time was George W. Bush, who, although most Wilsonians probably wouldn't want to claim him, he clearly, just go back and look at his 2005 inaugural address. If that's not a Wilsonian document, what is? Whereas Obama, a fellow Democrat like Wilson, is much more. Well, I'm not quite sure which category he falls. He's not a Jacksonian, that's for sure, but he's probably more of a Hamiltonian, frankly, in terms of just being kind of a realist. Although they do have, speaking of this nuclear weapon stuff, they do have a streak of utopianism in them as well. So all these four categories lend themselves to being mixed and matched according to in the eyes of the beholder, and then by the political players themselves.
And they're obviously provocative and useful categories, and they've had a pretty good shelf life as far as things that pundits come up with to categorize our ways of thinking about ourselves in the world are concerned. But as you can imagine, there are limitations. There are problems. People have picked away at these categories before, but they capture our imagination well enough so that they're still in use. And I guess I'm not surprised to see Newt use them here, as much as I am surprised, in a modest way, to see him being so upfront about which allegiance he thinks is the one to put your money on as a Republican.
Right, exactly. To the extent that Gingrich is a leader of the Republican Party and a possible presidential candidate, I mean, for him to, as you say, embrace Jefferson and Jackson, leaves out Hamilton and Wilson, and again, therefore, in a curious way, leaves out Bush, and definitely puts him on the revolt of the Rustics, which is a phrase used about the Jackson campaign, side of the ledger, which I guess speaks to the contemporary Republican Party. Although you made a point on email prior to our discussion that there's another figure from back then that ought to get thrown into this equation as that Meade doesn't mention, but is probably worth mentioning in this mix.
Right, Calhoun. The infamous the infamous South Carolinian and sort of the last intellectually respectable Southern firebrand, I might say, who was the big proponent of nullification. There's the famous toast where Jackson and Calhoun were at a banquet table, and Jackson stands up and proposes his toast, and he says, "To the Union it must be preserved." And Calhoun lifts his glass and says, "Next to our liberties most dear." Right? So, burn. Take that, Jackson. Of course, that's a great zinger, and that sheds some light on something that I'll have to talk about in a few seconds. But what's interesting to me here is that, nullification, after all, the doctrine that states could simply not accept and did not have to enforce federal laws more or less at their discretion, right? This was a strategy to preserve the Union, right? This was an alternative to secession. So when you have Southerners agitating for secession from the Union because of the federal government, tyrannical, encroaching, telling us what to do, the only thing that we can do is leave, right? Break apart the Union. Nullification suggests, wait, you don't have to go that far. Maybe there's some other way to work around this. Maybe we can find some sort of constitutional doctrine that will let off some of that steam and release some of that pressure, and in fact allow the Union to hold together. So people should hesitate before they lump Calhoun in with all those horrible Southern secessionists, right? Regardless of what you think about secessionists, you should hesitate before you lump Calhoun in, because the doctrine of nullification is, at least on my read, and I think it's a pretty reasonable one that's at bottom unionist.
Right, although, and nullification, as I understand it, is not currently allowed, right? So if you're a state, you can't opt out of federal regulation, at least in the big ones. So, right. In other words, the option, since the Civil War, the option of nullification has kind of been off the table, right?
Yes, it is. However,
okay,
for some people, and it's interesting how, again, you start to see the legacy of Calhoun popping up in interesting ways on the right and the left, right, where people are concerned about the shape that popular tyranny might take, and the idea that certain political minorities, without regard to kind of race, class, gender, or the typical minority classes that we think of or talk about today, political minorities need, according to this argument that shows up on the right or the left, depending, to have some sort of constitutional or legal recourse to defending their own rights at times when they seem to be on the decisively losing end of things for a number of years.
Right. What Calhoun, I think, who was curious enough, vice president under both John Quincy Adams and until he resigned, Andrew Jackson. I mean,
right.
The laws were different back then about how you got to be vice president. I think was actually a brilliant political thinker. He was fighting for, or not physically fighting, but politically fighting for. Because he died, I think, in 1850, so long before the Civil War started. A Southern point of view that is, again, with the exception of, has been out of favor and and much decried. I think he sort of figured out early on that, look, any constitutional framework you set up will naturally lead the majority. You can put all the protections for minority rights you want in there, but the majority will always always tend to crush them. So you need ever more elaborate protections for states' rights and so on, and minority rights. And again, we see that, as you said, on both the left and the right, where people are saying, look, our group is special, whether it's homeschoolers on the right or medical marijuana, if you will, on the sort of libertarian/left. Anyway, Calhoun was acutely aware that the majority will always kind of seek to get its way and will trample over almost any constitutional protection. So he was spending his time dreaming up more constitutional protections as a way of protecting the minority. And again, one of those mechanisms was nullification, which, if that's off the table, then what's Governor Perry of Texas supposed to do if he feels so strongly about No Child Left Behind or the stimulus package or whatever else, Obamacare, whatever else the national administration is doing?
Right. It ends up radicalizing the opposition, which of course has consequences of the sort that we saw during the Civil War. At its worst, of course, I'm not suggesting that anyone's really going to secede nowadays. If anyone's going to secede, right, it's those crunchy hippies in Vermont who keep having their secession conventions. It's not going to be the state of Texas. But actually, let me ask you this, because this is something that's been sort of nagging at me, and I haven't had an opportunity to actually look it up. Is it possible for somebody nowadays to run independently seeking the vice presidency?
I don't know. You caught me flat-footed here,
Well, the reason why this popped into my head, not just for academic interests, and certainly not as a gotcha question, but say Sarah Palin says, you know what, I'm going to run for the vice presidency, not on the Republican ticket, not on the Democratic ticket. I'm just going to run on the Sarah Palin for vice president ticket. What happens? right? What if people vote for Sarah Palin for vice president?
Yeah, I know that you can file in the New Hampshire primary, which, for vice president, you can say, everybody else is running for president in the New Hampshire primary. I mean, you pay $1,000 and you're in. And I know you can file for vice president. Maybe the Blogging Heads audience knows the answer, or certainly Google does. But by the way, speaking of Palin, how do you assess her and her $12 million and everything else that she's up to these days?
Well, I think Sarah Palin is obviously a very charismatic and entertaining figure. I am in broad agreement with Palin on a number of important issues. As a Republican, I welcome her participation in the great spectacle of political commentary. And in the grand scheme of things, I think she's much better off for herself and everyone making $12 million running around the country, doing rallies and that sort of thing, than not making $12 million and trying to run for president. So my advice would be... Would this, I'm not trying to bait you here, would this be a little bit of damning with faint praise? I mean, a little bit, with a wink and a smile. I mean, I think that Palin is a bigger and better asset for people on the right, broadly speaking, if she is talking about what she wants to talk about in a highly public way without seeking higher office.
So do you think Senator Scott Brown of Massachusetts was smart to stay away from the Boston Tea Party? Well,
if he was, generic senator and I was generic consultant, I would advise him to do what he did. But definitely, as the senator from Massachusetts, I think he made the right move.
Yeah, I agree. He's up again in 2012, so he's got to come to grips with the state that goes 2-1 Democratic for president.
And honestly, I don't know which Tea Partiers are going to lose any sleep over the fact that they couldn't get Scott Brown and Sarah Palin on the same stage, right? From the Tea Party perspective, let 1,000 people who are sympathetic to the Tea Party bloom. It doesn't matter if they're all on the same stage, if they're all making a serious difference, either on their own at the national level or on a state-by-state basis, right?
Right. I mean, since when was the Tea Party supposed to be some monolithic top-down organization? I mean, I'm sure there's 500 different Tea Party chapters or different organizations, and right. I mean, I'm sure they're all writing manifestos and constitutions and platforms, even as we speak. And more power to them. It's kind of an exciting development to watch.
And I
do find myself. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I do find myself wondering about the Tea Party movement. Stipulating that the people you see quoted in the paper are, Ayn Randians and Hayekians and Jeffersonians and so on. I have wondered to what degree the membership, and membership or self-identification, these are loose terms, are really genuine libertarians or are just sort of angry. In other words, if they're retired military or they're cops or on Medicare, they're probably not ardent out and out privatizers and government choppers the way that a lot of their leaders might make them out to be.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know the Winston Group has done some good polling on the Tea Parties. One of the first concerted efforts to kind of understand the Tea Parties as a block of voters and citizens. But some of these questions don't have answers yet. I know that in my home state, California, the idea that's circulated in some quarters that Tea Partiers are just Republicans with tri-cornered hats on is just ludicrous, right? The Tea Partiers are the people who have learned to despise the California Republican Party for a whole variety of reasons. These aren't just kind of Republicans wearing a different costume or attending different events. That said, there is a real opportunity to bring Tea Partiers and Republican conservatives back together, both informally and formally. Not by pandering, but by changing the agenda in certain key respects that I think would have a lot of traction nationwide.
Right, I was around probably for the greatest split between the sort of proto-Tea Party movement, which was the Perot campaign of 1982, and the Bush 41 re-election campaign. I mean, I was on the wrong. Perot lost as well, but I was on the Bush 41 effort, and that if you want to see the establishment versus the Rustics, to use a phrase about the Andrew Jackson campaign. That was it, and that was a wide split. And then I think Gingrich put them back together again in 1994, and I guess they've sort of come and gone back and forth ever since. Although in the test, a couple tests will be what happens with Rand Paul, not Ron Paul,
right.
In Kentucky against the sort of more establishment candidate Grayson. And then Ron Paul himself, who is in his mid-70s and has never, been more than a member of Congress, and yet is striving with the greats on the Republican straw poll circuit, and came within won the CPAC poll, the Conservative Political Action Conference, in earlier this year, and won it outright. And then came within a single vote of beating Mitt Romney out of thousands cast at the Southern Republican Leadership Conference in New Orleans, I guess just last week.
And then there's this new Rasmussen poll that's out, which some people have raised an eyebrow or two over, but it shows Ron Paul stacked up against President Obama, losing by 1 point in the hypothetical matchup. Dave Weigel was Twittering with me earlier today and saying, gosh, how much credence can you give this, really? And I remarked that, gosh, even if Ron Paul got 2/3 or even half of those numbers, I think that would still tell us something, regardless of whether or not the methodology of Rasmussen's has attained perfection, right? It has attained the Platonic ideal of polling. Even if he was getting those substantially smaller numbers, they would still, relatively speaking, be big numbers, numbers that would raise, I think, important questions about what's going on, broadly speaking, in American politics today.
Yeah, Rasmussen to me is just another pollster. I realize some people don't like him, but then some people don't like every pollster. But I am not aware. Methodologically, in terms of accuracy, I think it seems to me like he's up there with any of them in terms of predicting elections and so on, or outcomes. Unless you know different. And I have to tell you, when I think about President Obama, I go back and forth. On the one hand, he won a pretty big victory in 2008, and it's most elected presidents running for re-election get re-elected. I think 9 out of the last 13, something like that. On the other hand, you think about. Is Obama? When I see things like this nuclear disarmament stuff, I think of Jimmy Carter and kissing Brezhnev on the cheek and so on, and I think of David Dinkins, and I think of Dennis Kucinich, who before he was a member of Congress was the young, inexperienced, and wildly unpopular mayor of Cleveland for a single 2-year term back in the 70s, and I wonder if Ron Paul, who it's easy to say, he won't be the Republican nominee, but then you might think, well, what if he wants it? What if he runs? And what if he wins? Then we would see kind of a split inside the Republican Party, because Ron Paul is a personally incredibly nice, pleasant guy, but has a pretty strong message on a lot of fronts, from the IRS to the Federal Reserve to Homeland Security to the border.
Well, right, and a message that he seems completely unwilling to modulate in order to secure the nomination.
But what if he wins it anyway? That's kind of what I'm saying. If people are as angry as they seem to be, and right. What's been striking to me is that so much liberal left verity has, and that even conservatives agreed with. For example, there was the belief. Article of faith on the left, and frankly the right, a lot of the good chunk of the political right agreed with it, which was if the Democrats could ever get health insurance, Obamacare, through the legislation and sign it into law, that it would become an instant entitlement, it would be popular, and it would be another sort of ratchet on our path toward your choice, social democracy or Brezhnevism. And yet, what's so striking is that the polls steadily now for a month have shown, by more or less 4-3 margins, people think this is the bill's bad, and they want to see it, at least big chunks of it taken apart. We might have reached a point where, the kind of liberal welfare state of the 20th century just doesn't play very well for various reasons in the 21st century. And if so, then the voters, at least the Republicans, will be, and the independents too, maybe, will be looking for a pretty profound antidote, if you will, to Obama. And it could either be Ron Paul, and again, I would call him a long shot to actually get the nomination. But if he's in a position to win Iowa or New Hampshire or South Carolina or wherever, then he's going to have a lot of effect on the platform and the nature of the candidate who does get through that process. And if he doesn't, then I think you're looking at a pretty substantial prospect of a third party by somebody.
Yeah, I think liberals are really doing themselves in when they double down on the idea that respondents who continue to show resistance and even contempt for Obamacare just need to be re-educated, or I should say educated. That it's just an information deficit, and if only they learned how good this would be for them. Right? I mean, it's not really an economic question, I think. And this is what, if anything goes misunderstood about the Tea Partiers, I think it's this. They view the size and the scope of government as first and foremost a political and not an economic issue. Yes, the economics are important, and yes, there are questions of efficiency and what kind of creative power capitalism unleashes, and what kind of production you can have when it comes out of people that aren't being stifled by bureaucratic regulation. So yes, that's part of it. But it's really, I think, first and foremost a political issue. And if liberals don't understand that that's where the blowback is coming from on Obamacare, then they're not going to understand what to do about it. Which is sort of too bad for them, but it's good news for the other guys.
I think that's a great point. I mean, and I would we could even elaborate on this political issue, not an economic issue, by calling it sort of a moral issue. I mean, there's clearly something that affronts the public in the way that the welfare state, including Obamacare, is presented to the public now. We're taping this on Wednesday afternoon, and on Tuesday night on ABC News they had a feature. It was reported in the newspapers a couple days before that about these doctors in Afghanistan, military surgeons who confronted a patient, an Afghan soldier who'd been shot in the head with some unexploded ordnance, and it was still in his head. And so when they started operating on him, they realized this wasn't just a piece of metal in his head. This was actually a bomb. And they went ahead. They turned off all the electrical equipment and evacuated as many people as they could from the operating room. And they put on body armor, which I'm sure wouldn't necessarily have saved their lives. If the explosion goes off 2 feet away from you, you're likely to be killed or at least hurt. And then they operated on the guy, and he's fine. I mean, he's not fine, but he's survived, and the bomb's out of his head. Pardon?
Finer.
He's finer,
right.
Exactly. And they said, well, the reporters were asking, did you ever think about not operating on this guy? And this is too dangerous. They said, no, this is what we do. We're doctors. And, that plugs into the whole Hippocratic Oath and all the legend and lore of Marcus Welby and Dr. Kildare and so on. And, I mean, doctors and the AMA have been, kicked around pretty hard in the last half century, but people still mostly love them. And the medical profession is ranked very high and so on. And so, now to bring this back to the Obamacare issue, when Newt Gingrich, admittedly, he's kind of on my mind because he did a great job yesterday at this thing, and I wrote about it, or will write about it for Fox News, his appearance yesterday. when they want to put a bureaucrat between you and your doctor, as Gingrich says, and I'm sure there's plenty of people who say, well, that's not a fair statement at all. But I'm darn sure now, especially looking at these polls, that the average American would agree. Yeah, that's exactly what we fear. It's exactly what we don't want. And the history of sort of Great Society liberalism is any evidence. It's exactly what they will do sooner or later if they get the chance. And so, yeah, I agree that this is a political, and I would even say moral issue, much more than it is economic.
Well, the catchphrase or the zinger is putting government between you and your doctor. It's a nice hook. My formulation would be a little bit different. It's putting your doctor sort of between the government and you, right? So doctors can't serve two masters, right? And when it comes down to it, you're either sort of serving the government's interest in the system or serving the patient's interest. Someone's got to come first. You can't do both at the same time.
Yeah, that really lends itself to a chart or something like that. I mean, there's if you have the three actors, the doctors, the patients, the government, and again, there's others like the insurance companies, and you could make the chart as simple or complicated as you wanted it to, but just to help people think through, what's the ideal relationship here. I've written a fair amount about healthcare myself and thought about this, and it's a fact that 88 cents out of every dollar of healthcare expenditures are paid for by some third party, whether it's the government or an insurance company or charity or various other funding mechanisms. Those are the big ones. So inherently, if a third party is picking up 9/10 of the bill, there is some interference and ulterior motives, going on, and yet even so, there's a sacredness of the doctor-patient relationship, which the courts have affirmed in cases, including Roe versus Wade, that the government is not allowed to get in the middle of, and if any of the cost control, curve bending efforts that the Obamacare people are talking about are real, and I frankly think they're all kind of a bluff just to get the bill passed, then they really will have another Tea Party revolution on their hands just when people wake up and realize that they're fiddling with that relationship.
Right. Well, I see we've got about 4 minutes left before our hour's up. Just to bring things back a little bit to Jacksonians and to the intersection of the political and moral, I wonder if you have a sort of a quick lightning round take on Confederate History Month, which has been in the news.
Oh, right. I'm a resident of Virginia, and I voted for Bob McDonnell last year. Look, Bob McDonnell is not a Confederate, but they wrote a statement that wasn't very smart, and they fixed it. It's a reminder if you're come into power, you will bring in sort of people from your campaign and sort of from the edges of ideology, and you got to watch them closely because every new administration, whether it's a governor or a president, Obama brought with him, Van Jones, I'm sure they didn't vet him very well. Again, I think we kind of agree that the Republican Party these days has got everybody agrees it's got sort of a Southern orientation, and so if you're a Southern Republican, you got to be careful to make sure you don't get tagged as an out-and-out Confederate.
Right. I'm also a Virginian, also a McDonnell voter, also not a Confederate, right? But my father was a student of Civil War history, and I've grown up with an unvarnished and relatively unromantic view of both the North and the South from a scholarly standpoint. Of course, the passion that goes into the war and the feelings that are still relatively raw are, of course, very romantic and freighted with all kinds of Americanism in its purest form, I think, on both sides. But the point that I would want to make here is that no matter what the intentions of Confederate History Month, even in its rewritten incarnation, and this is an officially recognized block on the calendar across the Deep South as well. It just seems to me to be reinforcing the idea that identity politics plays itself out first as tragedy and secondly as farce. This isn't something that Republicans or conservatives should be looking to as kind of a consolation prize for all of the advances that the left has been able to make. Creating months on the calendar that are marked out for awareness and colonizing our everyday life with these quasi holidays. It doesn't seem to me to be a terribly productive or rewarding place for conservatives to go. I appreciate the sentiment behind the proclamation, which is Americans aren't as educated or informed as they should be about the real Confederacy, what was really going on in the Civil War. And I'm talking about things like the difference between why the Deep South seceded and why the Upper South seceded, and who voted for the Constitutional Union Party and wound up becoming Confederates, and isn't there an interesting story there, and shouldn't we be educating ourselves about how they could make that kind of switch, and a lot of moving parts. A lot of underreported or misunderstood facts about the middle band of America. It's not just the Yankee North versus the plantation South. The story is a lot more complicated than that, and I think we'd all benefit from a national conversation that revolves around just a better informed understanding of what America looked like then and how it relates to the way America looks now.
I agree. Just to add a little optimistic, code at least for me. Again, the Tea Partiers. I mean, they're trying. I mean, we've had the worst educated populace probably in the last few decades in terms of civics and Americanism and all these things that are sort of antique. You barely even hear them anymore. And the Tea Partiers are struggling to read the Federalist Papers and the Constitution, and people will make fun of them, for what they say and so on. But they're at least trying, and they're at least aware that something important was going on in the 18th and 19th century, and we ought not to completely forget about it in the 21st century. And when you see that Democratic congressman from Pennsylvania, I think his name was Hare, H-A-R-E, saying, "Look, I don't care about the Constitution." And you see the Republican congressman from New Jersey, who didn't even know the difference between Lobiando, his name, between the First Amendment of the Constitution and Article 1 of the Constitution. It makes you appreciate somebody who is, was asleep through high school, but is now reading that stuff for the first time, and he's 45 years old as he's, marching on Springfield, Illinois, or Columbus, Ohio. Good for him.
Right. Agreed. The facts ultimately speak for themselves, and we still do have the resources to go back to that material, whether it's the Federalist Papers or diaries, the Constitution itself. It's all there, and it's still, in spite of how horribly we can educate ourselves sometimes officially, it's still comprehensible to us. So that's the good news.
Exactly. Still right. Exactly. So on that note, James, nice talking to you.
Jim, thanks for a good chat.
You bet. All right.
Bye-bye.